sure she didn't.
I didn't even notice.
Yeah, I didn't either.
But thank you for your apology. It's accepted.
It's the Catholic guild. Stays with me for 2 weeks.
I did it once by memory in college. I had to go see a professor about something, and he had a class at a time. Just that day, I had insomnia for 3 days. So I was listening. My eyes were closed, but I was not asleep. I was listening. I was taking notes. I was sitting in the front of the class. So I went in to go visit him, and I felt like I didn't address that. And he looked at me and he said, I never let the crap out. I'm always speaking entirely. That's why. Look, why did I? Yes. We will be sending letters.
Email asking how you would like to be contacted. I said, but we haven't heard anything.
No, I know. I'm just like running around the altar. I know. Yeah, it's perfect. Project's not going away. But yes, we can send out if you want me to give you a call or sit down and talk with you instead. I'm happy to do that too.
Emails, whatever. Emails.
The whole group gets it, so everybody knows it.
Yeah. Yes.
What the mechanisms are.
We're kind of doing, so we're their consultants. The first thing we're doing is we're getting some of the major gifts. We all think you're in the major gift round. Please let me know. So we're trying to work through the folks that we've identified as the major gifts, and then we'll follow through with everybody else. Yeah.
Like shower.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's why we don't have all that stuff out. We're right now trying to get the web page up, and
I get it.
it's sort of this normally you do a capital campaign, you have 3 years of prep and silent stuff before anybody finds out about it. Guess what? It's 1.5 million, so we're not going to spend 3 years getting ready. We have to do this project now before it becomes a $3 million project. We're trying to catch up.
No, that's true.
But we're so glad that you all came.
Oh, yeah, it's exciting.
Thank you. I last week and this week and next week I missed up almost every single night, and my husband and I had the only night until the end of June without either his kids or my kids, and then now kids. So I said, okay, let's go ahead and do that. Yeah, that's supposed to do that. I wanted to see the program, but yeah, I guess we can start. Ready to go?
It's going.
Let's go. Okay. Well, we'll cut that part off when we start. Good evening and welcome, my friends. I recognize most all of you here, but there may be a few people who are new to the Athenaeum, and I welcome you as well. I'm Beth Hessel, the Executive Director. Most of you are longtime friends and members of the Athenaeum and know what a wonderful institution we are, how we provide opportunities for us to gather together as an intellectual community to look at history and art and architecture and literature and our world around us, and to engage in conversation and grow and learn together. And I think that is one of the things that makes the Athenaeum such an incredibly special place here in Philadelphia. And so we are glad that all of you are here tonight. We are really delighted for tonight's program. This is a fantastic book, Susan H. Brandt's Women Healers, Gender Authority and Medicine in Early Philadelphia. As you know, we have a long and deep history here of women as healers and medical leaders. Our guest tonight is Susan Brandt. She received her undergraduate degree from Duke University and her PhD in history from Temple. And then she completed a fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania McNeil Center for Early American Studies. Her dissertation on women healers was awarded the 2016 Lerner Scott Prize for the best doctoral dissertation in U.S. women's history by the Organization of American Historians. And one thing I really like about Susan is she, like me, was about 15 years old when you finished your dissertation about 5 years ago, right? She and I were both did our PhDs a little later in life and at the same time, so it's wonderful to have you here. She has published an article in Early American Studies and a chapter in Barbara Oberg's edited book, Women in the American Revolution, Gender, Politics, and the Domestic World. She teaches history at the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs, so we were really lucky that she had a number of speaking engagements in the area and was willing and able to come to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. And also, I guess we're talking about second career. Prior, you were a nurse practitioner, so bringing that actual real-world experience as a nurse. I ask all of you to join me in welcoming Susan Brandt to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia this evening.
Thank you. I really appreciate you hosting me here tonight in this beautiful historic library. It's just a real treat to be here, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have time for discussion and questions afterwards. Yes, I am. They're back. They're in the back. Absolutely. What a great question. I paid her to say that. Yeah, right. Okay. I'd like to start with an excerpt from my book to get you into the historical moment. And let me just get my clicker turned on here. And the quotes in my excerpt are from Elizabeth Coates Pascal's mid-18th century medical recipe book. She was a Philadelphia Quaker healer and merchant. And a lot of women kept household books that might include cooking, medicine, and other, kind of householdly things. But some women, like Pascal, it was predominantly medicine, and these are important sources of information on women's medical practice. Hers is particularly detailed, and it's at the College of Physicians. In her medical manuscript, Elizabeth Pascal recorded an outbreak of an illness in her neighborhood characterized by, quote, a violent swelling in the throat. As she noted, I was almost choked with the swelling and scarce able to swallow a drop of drink. She described the illness as quinsy, a pustular swelling around the tonsils that might have been caused by diphtheria or another infection. In severe cases, quinsy could lead to suffocation. Pascal's daughter was also afflicted. Amid her family health crisis, Pascal's neighbors sought her healing advice. Fortunately, she knew a Native American remedy that would perform the cure. As Pascal explained, she, quote, I made a strong tea of rattlesnake weed and put a vial funnel bottom upward on top of the teapot, advising sufferers to suck the steam strongly down your throat through the funnel, then gargle with rattlesnake weed tea. Pascal and her daughter were relieved in an hour, and her neighbors could eat and swallow anything in a few hours. And in the face of this severe illness, Pascal knew that she needed to describe rattlesnake weed with botanical precision so it wouldn't be confused with Seneca's snake root or rattlesnake root. According to Pascal, quote, rattlesnake weed grows wild on poor barren land. The stalk's about 2 foot high, straight and woody, with a deep red color of a birch. And her half-page depiction included leaves, the size and shape of tea leaves, indented round the edges, with small yellow flowers that bloom in September. The plant is easily recognizable either in the forest and fields or in botanical atlases as Hieracium venosum or rattlesnake weed. Pascal's entry in invokes Native American and Euro-American women's long-standing healing skills. However, her detailed descriptions also speak to her familiarity with the language of natural philosophers, the scientists of the period, and their project to reframe the vernacular knowledge of medicinal plants within the new science of botany. Pascal's margin notes, let me bring this over here, make this connection clear. She cited her cousin, John Bartram, a self-taught and internationally recognized botanist who participated in transatlantic scientific networks that included Carl Linnaeus, the founder of botanical taxonomies. And some of you may have been to, oh, wait a minute, whoop, I'm on the wrong, okay, there we go. Excuse me, here's John Bartram. Some of you may have been to Bartram's garden. There's the picture of Bartram's garden. So Pascal added, John Bartram says rattlesnake weed is good applied as a poultice to dispel the swelling in limbs or body. Over the course of her extensive medical recipe book, Pascal increasingly demonstrates her recognition of the emerging authority of Enlightenment science. And this new science, as they called it, challenged the long-standing preeminence of university degrees and ancient experts, and instead emphasized hands-on empirical knowledge that was accessible to women. Pascal's manuscript details her extensive medical networks that included Euro-American, Native American, and African American women and men. And here we have them. I jumped the gun. However, most 18th century Enlightenment natural philosophers maintained that reason and logic were male attributes. They argued that women and people of color were innately illogical, passionately emotional, and thus unfit for the rational and orderly enterprises of medicine and science. And here you see a few. And until recently, this discourse has been mirrored in the marginalization of women in histories of medicine and science. According to the scholar Patricia Farah, women haven't been written out of the history of science. They've never been written in. However, if we flip the traditional narrative and examine the history of science from the bottom up, the lines between science and folk healing are blurrier, and the story includes numerous women and men of various ethnicities and social orders. Indeed, Pennsylvania's settler colonial context enabled wider participation in scientific pursuits. And European governments and universities sent gentlemen of science, natural philosophers, to the Americas to discover commercially valuable plants and minerals. They sort of were bioprospecting in a current term. And these gentlemen of science recognized Native Americans, peoples of African descent, and ordinary colonists as critical sources of information about the natural world, even as they deemed them illogical, so, go figure. But through her self-directed studies, documented observations, and medical experiments, Pascal positioned herself alongside male experts as a legitimate producer of medical knowledge. Her self-confidence is reflected in phrases such as, "my own invention," and "cured when the doctors failed," which repeats like a refrain in her medical manuscript. And Pascal was not unique here in Philadelphia. And the example I read to you is one of 150 entries in Pascal's medical recipe book that, along with her business account book and her will, are the only records that she left behind. Her manuscript documents women's essential medical work in early Philadelphia. It also demonstrates that women were on the front lines of grassroots medical knowledge production, and some learned to wield the new authority of Enlightenment science. And these are two intertwined themes I'd like to talk with you about tonight. COVID has certainly foregrounded the role of women as essential workers, and here in this historic library it seems appropriate to think about women's roles in the dissemination of medical and scientific knowledge. So women were frontline workers in Philadelphia's early days, and their roles were diverse. Most women of various classes and ethnicity provided basic healing within their households, but others also delivered medical care to their communities. Some elite and middling women, such as the merchant Pascal, offered health care for free. Others took advantage of an unregulated medical marketplace with no licensure requirements that allowed women to set up as physicians and apothecaries or pharmacists. And again, there were also lay men who kind of would just deem themselves a, professor of physics or an apothecary. Black women retained African healing knowledge and practices despite the brutal forced migrations of the Atlantic slave trade. The freed woman healer Anna Bellamy, who specialized in bone setting, dentistry, and wound care in mid-18th century Philadelphia, was described as, quote, a woman of education and the Black doctor. According to several accounts, the Lenape healer, Hannah Freeman, was, quote, a doctress as well as a basket maker. And the Lenapes, sometimes you hear the older term Delaware Indians. A Chester County resident remembered visiting Freeman, quote, in her wigwam and paying 5 shillings for a remedy for my sick children comprised of herbs and pounded roots with directions for their use. Women healers of various social orders, including women of color, worked as doctresses, bone setters, cancer specialists, midwives, eye specialists, herbalists, and nurses, to name a few. Many prepared and sold popular patent medicines or peddled them door to door. And this freewheeling medical marketplace is a very different environment from ours in the 21st century, where we place healthcare workers in rigid categories that are determined by state regulations. We have, that define physicians, nurses, nurse practitioners, physicians assistants, physical therapists, pharmacists, and so on. And in the past, healing identities were much more fluid. So my expansive term, women healers, encompasses a spectrum of paid and unpaid healing work, including diagnostic, prescriptive, therapeutic, pharmaceutical, obstetrical, and nursing services. And women's healings practices could incorporate any of these and might change over the course of their lifetime. However, despite their essential medical work, women practitioners are underrepresented in histories of early America, and this marginalization persists. As Campbell Robertson and Robert Gebeloff point out in a recent New York Times article on the COVID pandemic, quote, from the cashier to the emergency room nurse, to the drugstore pharmacist, to the home health aide taking the bus to check on her older client, the soldier on the front lines of the current national emergency is most likely a woman. The newspaper's data analysis found that 1 in 3 jobs held by women has been designated essential. Moreover, women hold 76% of all healthcare jobs in the U.S. Nurses comprise the largest segment, and over 90% are women. Robertson and Gebeloff argue that many of the workers who populate this unseen labor force are underpaid and undervalued. And this persistent lack of historical voices for women practitioners is one of the reasons I became interested in this topic during my doctoral studies when I embarked on a second career in history after my first profession as a nurse practitioner. When Susan Klepp, my dissertation advisor, introduced me to Elizabeth Pascal's medical recipe book, I was hooked. And my mind strayed back to the 1980s when I worked in a clinic in a medically underserved area in the mountains of North Carolina, where I met women lay healers and granny midwives who had these respected practices, and they also had their medical recipe books with remedies that had been collected, curated, and passed down from mother to daughter through generations. And they, even though I was sort of ostensibly, the healthcare expert, I was in my 20s and still finding my feet, these practitioners would give me medical advice or herbs such as ginseng, Solomon seal, or yellowroot to make healing teas. And of course, when I was pregnant, I got lots of advice. I remember one time, how it is when you're pregnant, people come up to you at the grocery store. Well, I was examining a patient, she was up on the exam table, and I was looking at her ears with the otoscope. And I was kind of about 8 months pregnant, I was kind of pretty big, and the little plastic tip fell off onto the ground. So I bent down to scoop it up, and suddenly the woman screamed. And I looked up and said, "What? What's wrong? Are you in pain? What is it?" And she said, "Honey, if you squat down like that, you're going to tie the baby's cord around its neck." I said, "Okay." And I knew at the time that I should be recording these important world histories, but I was distracted by my family and work and the things that kind of get in the way. So, but when I opened Pascal's book, I remember these women, and knew that I could honor them by writing a history of women healers. And as I began my dissertation research back in 2009, I remember reading Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's Midwife's Tale, The Life of Martha Ballard, written in 1991. Some of you may have read that book. And Ulrich brought Ballard's midwifery practice to life, and she melded it in with broader cultural, political, and economic histories. It's kind of a real classic. Susan Clapp, my advisor's book on early birth control and family planning, revolutionary conceptions, and the healer's calling, that's on 17th century New England, gave me additional strategies for trying to uncover women's vernacular practices. And meanwhile, there have been some excellent recent works on enslaved midwives in the U.S. South and the Caribbean. But particularly at the time, I was puzzled that very few historians had followed in these scholars' train until I began my own research and discovered just how difficult it is to unearth these practices that were often transmitted through oral circuits and not, really written down. And especially in archives that often the goal is to write national histories or perhaps have, kind of famous scientific discoveries. So these kind of fly under the radar. And perhaps not surprisingly, standard historical narratives often depict women healers as amateurs and emphasize their declining influence. So to unearth women healers, I visited over 30 libraries in the US and the UK, and sifted through endless sources. It was really an archaeological dig, but it was also a lot of fun. And I discovered that women have long served as essential medical workers in Philadelphia. And I'd like to give you an overview of the book so that you can meet a few of the numerous women that I've recovered in my research, and you can watch for them as essential workers and their engagement with science. In 8 loosely chronological chapters, beginning in the late 17th and going into the early 19th, I explore women's medical work and the ways that they appropriated various types of medical authority in order to counter attempts to marginalize their practice. And I do kind of try to complicate. There's sort of a narrative that was big in the 1980s that, particularly that male obstetricians, that women were sort of the victims of male obstetricians taking over their practices. And I do try to complicate that because I do see women in this unregulated medical marketplace collaborating with physicians and male lay healers as well as other practitioners or competing with them. So it's I see a bit more of a free-for-all rather than kind of the victim role. And I start with healing legacies. As they settle in the greater Philadelphia area, Anglo-American women built on the cultural authority and legacies of their foremothers in England. Guillermo Penn, the wife of Pennsylvania's founder, William Penn, was cited in a biography as, there's something updating here on the computer, I just wanted to be sure it wasn't there. So Guillermo Penn was cited in a biography as being skilled in physics, in medicine, and surgery. She kept a medical recipe manuscript that maps her expert knowledge of what we would recognize as medicine, surgery, ophthalmology, pharmacy, and nursing. And the manuscript has even deeper roots. It was passed, I think, let's just see, there's something here. Windows is continuously improving. Either we can restart or remind me later. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Microsoft. Thanks, Bill. Okay, here we are. We're still at Guillermo Penn and her grandmother, Kathryn Partridge Springett, who, according to one account, saw, quote, 20 patients in a morning and cared for long-term invalids at no charge. And of course, much of this healing work was done by her servants, but still Springett was a very innovative practitioner. She healed, quote, healed a child with a severely burned skull, shrouding it with a pan of beaten silver covered with a bladder. And Springett was so proficient in cataract surgery that, quote, Stevens, the great oculist, sent many to her house when there was difficulty of a cure. And it was not unusual for women to be ocular experts who not only prescribed medicines, but couched cataracts using a flat needle to displace the cloudy lens, because this was the same skills that they learned in decorative needlework. You know, they had those fine motor skills. I'm glad that I'm not that person that's being held out there. And their recipe book demonstrates that both Springett and Penn engaged with ideas of early modern science. And they also deploy both the standard humoral medical theories that physicians and surgeons used, as well as newer chemical theories that were coming in. And Penn copied the popular chemical medicine Elixir Proprietatis and added her own embellishments. Again, there was sort of this mixture of both older humoral theories as well as sort of chemical, alchemical practices coming in. As Lady Damaris Masham, a fellow gentlewoman of science, argued, I see no reason why it should not be thought that all science lies as open to a lady as to a man. Along with her husband, Guillermo Penn was instrumental in establishing a radical sect called the Society of Friends, or Quakers. In his writing on education, William Penn emphasized the importance of teaching girls as well as boys useful skills, useful knowledge, which included botany and healing skills. And Penn's language is mirrored in the Athenaeum's mission statement that emphasizes the dissemination of useful knowledge. Quaker women conveyed to Pennsylvania their useful medical skills as well as their radical ideas about equality, female education, and public activism. Friends also rejected professional hierarchies, which allowed lay healers to challenge learned physicians' authorities. You know, they wouldn't tip their hats to anyone. And here you see Quaker women preaching in public, which was far outside the norms, the kind of biblically prescribed norms that a woman was not to speak in church and never usurp the authority of a man. So Quakers, particularly that time, were kind of outside the norm. Beulah J. Coates was one of these first settlers who passed down these radical norms to her daughter, Elizabeth Coates Pascal, and Quaker subversive norms informed the way that gender operated in early Philadelphia. And as we've seen, Pascal's recipe book documents how she fashioned medical authority, becoming an influential node within complex, mutually affirming webs of medical information exchanges that cross the lines of gender, race, and class. She recorded an elderly black healer's cure for a putrefied joint that prevented an amputation. A, quote, country man advised Pascal's servant Martha Owen of a concoction of juniper oil to cure laryngitis after she, quote, applied to several doctors and found no relief. Pascal noted a rheumatism cure that was a true copy from Dr. John Pyle of North Carolina, given to me by his aunt, Sarah Way. On healing borderlands, Pascal also sought remedies from indigenous people. She recorded a Native American woman's successful remedy that used parts of the North American elder to cure an infected wound. And as we've seen, European men of science sought indigenous women's expertise. During his plant collecting travels in the mid-Atlantic in the 1740s, Peter Kalm, a Finnish naturalist who was part of Bartram and Pascal's scientific networks, and recorded his encounters with indigenous women. He noted in his journal, quote, the wife of Colonel Lydia suffered from severe leg pain, causing her to limp with the aid of a crutch. Finally, the native woman came to Mrs. Lydias's house, saw Mrs. Lydias, then went into the forest, took twigs and cuttings of the dogwood, removed the bark, boiled them in water, and rubbed Mrs. Lydias's legs with the water. The pain disappeared within 2 or 3 days, and she was cured, end quote. Unfortunately, over time, as these remedies became part of the standard European pharmacopoeia, physicians erased these botanicals' indigenous origins. The emerging prestige of Enlightenment science could be used to denigrate the practices of both Native American and Euro-American women. But nonetheless, some women used the new power of Enlightenment science to maintain their healing authority. So let's segue back to the beginning and continue to think about the authority of science. Libraries, like the one we're in now, became sites for the dissemination of useful medical and scientific knowledge for women as well as for men. Pascal compiled information from authoritative medical texts that she checked out from the Library Company of Philadelphia, founded in 1731 by her friend Benjamin Franklin. And some of the books that she checked out are included here, written by prominent scientists Robert Boyle and Hermann Boerhaave, like Boyle's Law. You know, these are known today, but particularly prominent at that time. Although the library company initially denied women membership, Pascal circumvented this barrier by checking out books under the auspices of her male family members. And women's de facto participation opened the way for their later official membership at the library company in the 1770s. The library company was also a philosophical society, displaying scientific instruments and natural curiosities to feed a fashionable appetite for popular science. It sponsored lectures and demonstration that attracted spellbound spectators, including women. Ben Franklin awed audiences with the sparks and jolts produced by electrical machines while lecturing on the newly discovered electrical fire. Others experimented with air pumps, observing birds gasping for breath when placed in beakers that were evacuated by a vacuum pump. So it's kind of hard to see, but you know, don't try that at home. That would not meet the experimental requirements now. Popular science dovetailed with the popular health movement and a self-help print culture, which promoted a profusion of pamphlets that authored all people, every patient, to be their own doctor or doctress, which challenged physicians' authority. Medical and scientific information became accessible to the public. Pascal tells us that she checked out Dr. Robert James's medicinal dictionary, which was in 3 folio volumes, each over 1,200 pages. And, you know, as you know, here at the library, a folio is one of those really big books. And we can imagine her, you know, maybe checking out the book or maybe kind of hefting it onto the library room reading table, discussing it with patrons, or, you know, she says she checked it out. Maybe she's like walking down Market Street, you know, hey, what have you got? Oh, Dr. James. And maybe putting it on the countertop in her shop. And again, imagine the discussions the scientific discussions that might have happened. The dictionary reinforced Pascal's interest in botany and chemistry, as well as the authoritative discipline of anatomy, which was becoming the marker of a learned physician. After reading a section in the dictionary, she transcribed a remedy for a bronchocele tumor while describing a public anatomical dissection at London's Royal Society. And again, this is the preeminent philosophical society at the time. To discover a passage about a bronchocele, Pascal plowed through 15 densely written folio pages describing an anatomical dissection presented by, quote, the preeminent and ingenious Dr. James Douglas, and he was indeed a preeminent anatomist at the time. According to Douglas, I had lately the opportunity of opening a woman about 50 years old who had a very large tumor in the forepart of the neck. The fleshy fibers of the latissimus colli were scarcely visible. The mastoideus and the coracohyoideus were extremely thin. It was connected to the levator scapulae, and he goes on and on. Through the medium of print, Pascal could virtually sit in on the anatomical dissection. And if she had questions about the terminology, she could refer to the many anatomical diagrams in the dictionary. As she poured through this esoteric anatomical language, Pascal documented more earthy similes that matched her own tactile diagnostic experiences. She found resonance with Douglas's description of the tumor as having the consistence of a cow's udder when boiled. Significantly, Pascal also copied a section that lauded not the university-educated physicians, but rather an Englishwoman healer who cured the tumors without exposing them to risky surgery, and surgery was indeed quite risky without anesthesia or antibiotics. Douglas explained, I was formerly acquainted with a woman who is in great reputation for resolving these tumors. Her secret consisted in anointing the part frequently with the oil of chamomile made by infusion. As she copied the passage, Pascal extended her medical networks to include an Englishwoman in the virtual world of print. Pascal identified and foregrounded the contributions of a woman healer like herself, who might otherwise be effaced in scholarly writings. Pascal constructed a more inclusive narrative of women in medicine and science, and she wrote herself into the story. And women healers had to overcome not only the challenges of Enlightenment science, but also the emergence of a male culture of market capitalism. Nonetheless, both elite and working class women harnessed a flourishing flourishing market in pharmaceuticals to develop profitable entrepreneurial medical practices. Pascal's friend, Elizabeth Bartonbee, a Quaker minister and healer, set an early precedent by publishing the first pharmaceutical advertisement in a Pennsylvania newspaper in 1721. She touted her spirit of scurvy grass and her right and genuine spirit of Venice treacle, truly and only prepared by her in Philadelphia, being the only original and first producer of it in this city. And Venetian theriac, or Venice treacle as she called it, was a pastiche of over 50 ingredients used to treat the plague. Much later, medical entrepreneurship allowed women to navigate the economic downturns of the American Revolutionary period. The widowed healer, Margaret Hill Morris, had long provided free care to her community, and during the Revolution, she treated sick soldiers on both sides of the conflict. She noted in her journal, some sailors and their wives being sick and no doctor in town, they were told Mrs. Morris was a skillful woman and kept medicines to give to the poor. As they were very ill with a fever, I treated them according to art. However, finding herself in financial distress by the 1770s, Morris decided to, quote, get into a little business. As I've long supplied many gratuitously, she said, I might as well charge for my services. Morris opened a medical and apothecary practice in Burlington, New Jersey. She diagnosed, prescribed, compounded medicines, and dispensed medicines, and provided nursing care. Morris noted, there's not a dose of medicine to be got in this town without coming to me for it. I feel quite alert at the thoughts of doing something that may set me a little step above absolute dependence. Morris and her networks demonstrate how women maintain their medical credibility while transitioning from unpaid to paid medical work. Back in Philadelphia, the apothecary Elizabeth Weed exemplifies women who took over family businesses after the death of male kin. Following the British occupation of Philadelphia in 1777, Weed announced in the Pennsylvania Evening Post that despite her husband's passing, she would carry on his apothecary practice as she, quote, has his receipts and been employed these several years past in preparing them herself. She assured readers they could, quote, depend on being supplied as usual with the syrup and powder for the flux, the syrup of balsam, the royal balsam, bitter tincture, essence of tar, and etc. And Weed's subtext was, I've been in the back room doing the work all along, so you can still depend on me. And a decade, of course, she had to support her family, and this was critical work for women at the time, for widows at the time. A decade later, she was so successful at marketing her proprietary Weed syrup that it gained brand name recognition. However, she was shocked to discover that the crafty James Kraft, a barber and a shoemaker, was guilty of counterfeiting her medicine. Weed announced in the Pennsylvania Gazette that she was suing the base, vile forger. She not only developed a new pharmaceutical, but she used the press and the courts to defend her intellectual property in her proprietary medicine. Medical consumerism and a culture of self-help medicine empowered women healers. Their economic successes attest to these women's ongoing medical authority. And women continue to market their medicines and healing advice. Mary Waters, a widowed Irish immigrant, learned valuable skills as a nurse in Continental Army hospitals during the American Revolution. Unfortunately, Weed's healing acumen caught the attention of Dr. Benjamin Rush, that we know, a prominent university-educated physician, and he wrote a biographical sketch. According to Rush, quote, Waters served during the whole war in the military hospitals where she was esteemed and beloved by all who knew her. Surprisingly, Rush described nursing as a noble occupation. In fact, at this time, paid nurses of lower orders had a long-standing association with criminality, drunkenness, theft, and prostitution. And here you see this caricature of the humors of a hired nurse in a collection called Miseries of Human Life. And, it's a little bit hard to see, but, she's kind of she's dead drunk, fallen asleep, neglecting the patient, tucked over the candle and about to burn the house down. And again, this was the kind of thing that nurses, this was below domestic service. So Waters had kind of a steep curve to fight against. But nonetheless, despite prejudices here in Philadelphia against Irish women and these prejudices against nurses, Waters deployed her medical acumen and wartime contacts in Philadelphia to create physician and patients referrals for a practice as a nurse, doctress, and apothecary. She strategically publicized her medicines on the cover of the Weekly magazine in 1798, touting the safety and efficacy of her signature worm cakes, along with Huxham's tincture of bark, lavender compound, and others. As Waters and Weed created new pharmaceuticals, they also shaped customers' expectation that health was a commodity that money could buy. The growth of a self-interested capitalist marketplace was accompanied by a popular culture of humanitarian sensibility that lauded those who exhibited deeply felt self-sacrificing benevolence. And some women deployed this sensibility, this culture of feeling, to deflect stereotypes of paid caregivers as drunks and prostitutes. However, when Philadelphia's African American women, such as Sarah Bass, risked their lives to provide vital nursing care for white Philadelphians during the devastating 1793 yellow fever epidemic, a popular publisher used racialized imagery to denounce them in the press. At the insistence of Bass and the nurses, their ministers, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, and Mother Bethel, that you probably know, wrote a pamphlet that affirmed the nurses' authority as self-sacrificing humanitarian healers who demonstrated African Americans' worthiness for civil equality. And this was 60 years before Florence Nightingale introduced a global audience to the idea of nursing as a humanitarian pursuit during her work as a nurse during the Crimean War. And this yellow fever nursing was challenging bedside nursing. Contemporaries described patients with chills, fevers, nosebleeds, jaundiced eyes, black vomit, and comatose delirium. And again, we see women of color providing essential services during an epidemic. And the nurses clearly deserved more than racialized recriminations. Their voices are echoed in the pamphlet's conclusion. Although we've been slandered by unprovoked enemies, we are confident we shall stand justified. And women healers' achievements in the early decades of the 19th century were obscured by a powerful discourse of domesticity that sought to relegate women to the private household sphere, safe from the perils of the business domain. Nonetheless, Euro-American and African-American women continued to embrace medical entrepreneurship and deploy the culture of humanitarian sensibility to counteract both the constraints of domesticity and physicians and pharmacists' attempts to marginalize their practice. After her father, and here's an example, Elizabeth Marshall, after her father, Charles Marshall, bankrupted the family's apothecary business that had been founded in 1730 by her grandfather, Elizabeth Marshall assumed the leadership in 1806 and grew it into one of the nation's first pharmaceutical manufactories. Marshall trained numerous male apprentices, worked with Dr. Benjamin Smith Barton to create a new drug in 1814 called Mistura glycyrrhizae composita that was included in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia. Okay, it was a cough medicine. She sold the company in 1825 to Elizabeth Pascal's grandson. Ironically, historians press the memories of Marshall's achievement along with those of numerous other women who practiced as apothecaries and healers. And here's an example of a current PowerPoint slide for a class of pharmacy students. And it depicts Elizabeth's grandfather, Christopher Marshall, the founder, and his sons, Charles and Christopher. And remember, it was Elizabeth's father, Charles, now grown up, who wrecked the company. And there's no next slide that discusses Elizabeth's extraordinary achievements, just the Marshall men. So we have to look closely to find women entrepreneurs and healers' ongoing work. Fortunately, the rise of female academies countered notions of women's mental inferiority and provided them with skills in oratory and organization, allowing them to become public health educators and leaders in health reform. Sarah Mapps Douglas is an excellent example. She was a founding member of the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. She was an educator, school principal, and also a health educator. She felt that health was important, kind of part of the uplift of the community. And other women embraced non-traditional medical movements and became practitioners in homeopathy, Thomsonianism, and hydropathy, also called the water cure, which challenged regular doctors' authority. In 1839, when Mary Gope Nichols, a water cure practitioner, sexual health educator, and free love advocate, visited Philadelphia, she wrote to a friend that unlike residents of other cities, here she found support. Philadelphia, she said, is a city of women, with more intelligent women here than I have ever found in any other city. So, right? And men too. and the guys too. And Dr. Joseph Longshore agreed when in 1851 he addressed the first graduating class of the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania, the world's first women's medical school here in Philadelphia. He celebrated this eventful epoch in the history of woman. Woman's intellect, he said, is fully capable of comprehending the various branches of a thorough medical education, defying the belief that woman is intellectually inferior to man. He continued, after treading the rugged paths of science, you may look from behind the impenetrable fortress of scientific attainment with well-founded confidence. In 1855, Dr. Ann Preston, one of those first graduates, addressed a new incoming class, and she offered encouragement to women medical students embarking on a, quote, new and untried course. And the history of women in medicine often begins with the founding of the Female Medical College. However, as we've seen, Preston and her colleagues continued the legacy of women healers who've been essential healthcare workers for centuries. In fact, Preston's new and untried course was merely one signpost on a well-trodden path populated with medically skilled women. So women healers were not inflexible traditional practitioners destined to fall victim to the onward march of Enlightenment science, capitalism, and medical professionalism. Instead, women adapted their practices as they found new sources of healthcare authority. Professional women physicians, nurses, pharmacists, as well as lay women healers in North Carolina, or maybe Powwow or Apothecary doctors, the Pennsylvania German doctor, lay healers here, would later build on this foundation. The COVID-19 pandemic reminds us that women healers, their long-standing medical work, and their contributions to medical and scientific knowledge deserve recognition. Yay. And I think that we sometimes we forget the shoulders that women physicians and women, nurses, physicians, and other practitioners really stood on the shoulders of some of these, very pioneering women in healthcare practice. Yeah. Cool. Great histories. Yes?
Did any of the potions or salves or ointments make it into modern production and are still used?
Yes. Some of the things like, salicylic, like willow tree bark, salicylic acid. Some of them are more, part of like non-traditional herbal practices. One of the ways of doing history of medicine is to, having been a nurse practitioner, I'm always going like, so did it work? What was going on? What are those things? And one of the other ways, though, that historians look at logic of what was happening. But yes, some of them did. There was something called Deschler's salve. There was Mary Deschler, a friend and neighbor of Elizabeth Pascal, that did get into a pharmacopoeia, and I still see blogs looking for this. It was kind of a salve for wounds, how do you Mary Deschler's salve? So yes, some of them, and again, a lot of the indigenous botanicals did, come into the materia medica and were used for quite some time. It's sort of almost like the way we kind of still bioprospect for botanicals that we don't know.
There's a photograph of the Apothecary next to what used to be a restaurant for all the reconstruction of the restaurant for all the people in the people who signed the Declaration of Independence.
Oh,
And we were
yeah.
debating it. Was that the actual place of it, do you think? It's on Second Street.
I just drove by that. I think it's like, what is the restaurant there?
It's not
Is the
anymore.
City Tavern?
It's
Yeah,
a
I was,
tavern, but it's not open.
yeah, I almost wasn't there, so aren't there apothecary jars in the
Yeah.
City
And,
Tavern? Yeah.
well, I don't know, but next door is the place in the photograph. And I just wondered if we knew whether it was there.
Yeah, I think the photograph that I used actually is, I think it's like stable, it actually, I think, is in Alexandria. There is a wonderful, so it,
That one.
is that, okay.
That's Market Street.
Okay, that's Market Street, okay.
No, it's not. Is it?
Okay, I
Oh,
think it is.
sorry.
Okay, I don't know, you guys can tell me. I kind of thought there is a great historical pharmacy in Alexandria, Virginia, that I do kind of borrow some pictures because I'm not sure that we have, there's like the Physic House. I don't know that we have an apothecary museum the way the Alexandria actually has a historic pharmacy from the 19th century, but yeah.
Well, I don't think the building I'm thinking of is open anymore, but it does masquerade as an
As an
apothecary.
apothecary shop, I'll have to check that out. Elizabeth Weed's shop was like on Water Street. I mean, it probably, it would have been long gone. So.
I believe there's a plaque on the west side of 7th Street, right above the Federal Building,
Uh-huh.
that indicates where the first pharmacy school was. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Now University Yards and all that. So I guess down in that general area, as I see some of the streets being called African.
Right.
Because you were showing where women's medical college, right around the corner, so to speak.
Right around the corner, yeah. And again, I believe that Christopher Marshall was the first president of the Society of Pharmacy. So, I mean, again, the Marshall, we really do, the Marshall's, pharmacy was, and it was the sign of the Golden Ball, James Watson, who has the old histories of Philadelphia, talks about remembering the fumes from, but he, one of the local historians actually says Elizabeth Marshall's manufactory. So again, she was kind of remembered at that time and then later kind of obscured. But yeah, it's fun to go around and find where things are. Yeah, Pascal's shop was on 2nd and Market Street.
I want to say that when I listened to Ken Burns, or watched Ken Burns' documentary a month or so ago, I thought nothing could be more illuminating about Philadelphia. I feel that way about your talk. I'm confident that that book I'm about to buy is going to be just as illuminating. I have a question. Have you ever eaten worm cake?
The question, I forgot, I'm supposed to be repeating the questions, and I apologize, I forgot to do that. The question is, have I ever eaten a worm cake? No, but, worms were a huge problem they were kind of ubiquitous, and there were different types of worms that could actually get into the lungs. I mean, you could actually be seriously sick from worm cakes. I have made tar water, the essence of tar, but I have not tried it because I wrote another paper on tar. This tar water was sort of an international phenomenon.
My mother was an uncredentialed botanist in West Virginia and North Carolina.
the University of Pennsylvania, a library, and it was in kind of in the back of her third husband's like commonplace book, and so I actually do have that recipe. And I was speaking several years ago at Cologne in Williamsburg, and I had the apothecaries from the historic apothecary shop. So I sort of said to them, "Does it work?" And they said, "Oh yes." And there was actually a retired physician and historian of medicine, and it actually did have senna and peppermint as well as opium. So we determined that yes, it really it did kind of slow the intestinal motility. So, but yeah, no, I love worm cakes.
I have an ancestor, Anne Morris Maddox. She was the sister of Robert Morris, financier of the rubber.
Yes.
And she was in West Virginia, and his lands were out there, some of his lands. After she was widowed, and she moved her whole family from Virginia to what is now West Virginia, she became a midwife and healer. This was it was a little bit after the Revolution.
I would love to have those documents. So, you were saying that, just to repeat this for the recording, that you had a family member who was in Virginia, West Virginia, as a midwife, and I would, if you have those documents, any family documents, let me know.
I have some in ancestry, some in mine. Yeah, I could find them.
See me after.
Yeah,
Yes,
okay.
thank you. You're my resource people. This is fabulous. This is why I'm here. This is what I love. I've always learned from you all. Yes.
Yes, when I first came back to Philadelphia, I got the faculty position at Medical College of Pennsylvania. When I first got there, I asked, well, why did they change the name? And they said, well, it's sort of reverse gender prejudice in that they wanted to get federal money, they had to end it man. And
Interesting.
it was just so bizarre to me that this women's medical college that had been there for so many years had to change its name because they had to have been men in order to get federal funding for research.
Yeah, so again, the irony that it was later the female medical college, the women's medical college, then MCP Hahnemann.
I went to Jefferson,
Uh-huh.
and I was in the second class that admitted me.
Wow, so that is really historic, and again, we remember.
It's bizarre.
Yeah, but I think we, sometimes, now, and I think especially young people take for granted, again, very pioneering people and, cool histories here in Philadelphia. Yes?
My great-grandmother, maternal great-grandmother in Ireland was the family healer in the late 19th century. Was changing up one of her sons was a physician, an actual medical physician. But I have a question. I read a little bit on this subject, and obviously this was a colony, and things were different. People had to rely on each other. They had to rely on different things. The women had to rely on each other for this information. But as it came into the Victorian period, women and the whole attitude towards women got squashed. Do you see any, for me there's a connection, I don't know about you, between the Victorian vision of women versus the original frontier colony thing where folks really did have to rely on women altogether.
Right, so the question is do we see changes as we kind of round into the 19th century, into kind of Victorian period? And yeah, it's kind of what I touched on, that culture of domesticity. It was a very powerful prescriptive culture of what women could and couldn't do. Ladies particularly, should be in the home, away from the, perils of the business domain. And that's kind of that's sort of the narrative that women lose healing authority going into the 19th century. And I think that's very real. But I also think there's a difference between sort of the prescriptive literature and what women are doing on the ground. So on the ground, I see women like Elizabeth Marshall, who are, really at the dawn of big pharma in Philadelphia, starting a manufactory. I see women continuing to practice as lay healers, women in some of the innovation is someone like Elizabeth Marshall. Again, I was sort of shocked to find that currently, that there's nothing, some pharmacy histories do talk about her, but even in the 19th century when they remembered Elizabeth Marshall, they would sort of go, well, she sort of started this pharmacy manufacturing, but then she retired and became a benevolent Lady Bountiful in Philadelphia. It was almost like, Victorian historians didn't really know what to do with a woman like that, and I think there are a lot of them on the ground. Lydia Pinkham she was in New York, but she was a Quaker woman who created Lydia Pinkham's pink pills that my aunts say we always, into the 20th century, people took Lydia Pinkham's pink pills. So women, I think the surprise for me was women entrepreneurs, not only, with medical practices, but with pharmacy as well. Yes?
Historically, men in universities studied humanities, and it was the women who studied chemistry and the sciences because they were the ones who were cooking, etc. And so I think that's an interesting flip also, that science was taught to women because they were the practical people. The men had the leisure to think great, powerful thoughts.
Right, and yeah, the comment, excellent comment that, there was a time when men studied humanities, women studied pragmatic things like chemistry. In fact, there were a colleague of mine, Jessica Linker, has found all these women's science academies in the late 18th and flourishing in the early 19th century that were science academies. And again, kind of putatively because cooking and dyeing and, all the things that women do were chemistry or, really kind of physics and other things like that. But ultimately, women took that information, those science academies, and, again, slowly under, the radar, were finding ways to get around that domesticity. Yeah. Thank you.
We could ask the one more question, maybe?
Another question? Yes.
Now I see so much about the Food and Drug Administration, and this is not approved by, so some of these elixirs, were they for a legality or something?
This was a let the buyer beware marketplace. The Pure Food and Drug Act, all of that comes in the early 20th century. So we really, this as much as, women were taking advantage of it as well as men, pharmacists and medical. It was, they talked about safety and efficacy, but they're really, when you look back at this, you appreciate the Pure Food and Drug Acts and all of those that came